Sign it now or walk away with nothing," my brother whispered as mourners watched me freeze beside Dad's casket. He slid the papers into my shaking hands. "You were never meant to inherit." Then the lawyer cleared his throat behind us. "My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 36 years old. I work as a public school librarian, the kind of person known for quiet reliability and keeping things organized when everyone else is overwhelmed. For the past 3 years, I cared for my father during his final illness with lung cancer, while my siblings stayed distant and uninvolved in his daily life. I handled his medications, paid his bills from my modest librarian salary, and woke up for late-night emergencies when he couldn't breathe or needed help to the bathroom. My family labeled me the helper, someone useful for managing the unglamorous work, but never important enough to include in actual financial decisions or estate planning conversations. I sacrificed opportunities for career advancement that would have required relocating to other school districts because I chose to remain nearby and provide the care nobody else would. My brother, Daniel, charismatic and confident with a successful sales career, positioned himself as the natural decision-maker after Dad died, speaking for the family at the funeral and organizing everything without consulting me. I live simply in a small rental apartment, avoid conflict whenever possible, and spent years believing that loyalty and showing up every day would eventually be recognized and valued. After the funeral, relatives I'd known my whole life treated me as an outsider in the very home I'd maintained and kept running during Dad's illness. I wasn't rich or glamorous, never made dramatic gestures or demanded recognition for what I contributed, but I had something they didn't expect. I had documented conversations about Dad's wishes, detailed caregiving records I'd kept for medical purposes, and a private promise my father had made to me during one of our late-night talks about what would happen after he was gone. If you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else walked away, this story will feel deeply familiar. Subscribe if you've been overlooked despite doing all the real work that actually mattered. Share your experience in the comments below about being excluded by people who should have valued you. Click like or hype if you believe loyalty should count for something in families. The funeral reception was held at the family home, Dad's house that I'd been cleaning and maintaining for 3 years. The air smelled like casseroles from neighbors and flowers from the service, sounds of quiet conversation filling rooms that felt too empty without him. Tension replaced mourning almost immediately. My brother Daniel gathered relatives in the dining room and presented a document he claimed showed I'd waived my inheritance rights months earlier. "You said you didn't want the burden of managing property and finances," he insisted loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. Everyone here remembers that conversation. My aunt nodded vigorously from across the table, supporting his version of events. Yes, Olivia said she just wanted to focus on her work and not deal with estate complications. I stared at the document, confused and shocked. The formatting looked unfamiliar and rushed, printed on plain paper instead of legal letterhead. My chair was physically removed from the dining table by my uncle, a symbolic exclusion that made several people look uncomfortable, but nobody objected out loud. Relatives immediately began discussing how to divide assets, talking about selling the house and splitting proceeds as if my presence and participation were already finalized as absent. A neighbor named Mrs. Rodriguez, someone I barely knew, stood near the kitchen and loudly claimed she'd seen me moving boxes out months before Dad died, implying I'd abandoned him. She wasn't around much at the end, she said with false sympathy. Daniel pushed the papers closer to me, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Sign this now or you walk away with nothing. That's your choice. Make it." The humiliation peaked as people watched me stand there, frozen, uncertain, grieving my father while being publicly erased from his legacy. Then Mr. Bennett, the family lawyer I recognized from years of Dad's legal matters, arrived unexpectedly at the door, carrying a leather briefcase and a sealed manila folder. His expression was serious and deliberate. The betrayals accelerated rapidly after that funeral reception ended without resolution. First, I was completely removed from all estate email communications and denied access to financial records I'd helped organize during Dad's illness. Bank statements stopped arriving at my address. When I called to ask why, I was informed that Daniel had updated all contact information and instructed them to communicate only through him as executor. Second, the locks at the family home were changed without notice or warning. I discovered this when I tried to enter using my key to retrieve some of Dad's medical files I needed for insurance purposes. The key didn't work. I knocked and Daniel answered through the barely open door that I needed to formally request entry and schedule visits in advance if I wanted to collect any belongings. I stood on the porch of the house where I'd spent countless nights caring for my father, suddenly treated like a stranger who needed permission to enter. Third, a public smear campaign began on social media. Posts appeared from extended family members about unnamed relatives who exploit vulnerable elderly people financially, who take advantage of illness to manipulate assets. They never used my name directly, but the timing and context made it unmistakably clear who they meant. Coworkers at the school library began asking me uncomfortable questions after seeing posts that mutual acquaintances had shared, asking if there was any truth to rumors that I'd mishandled my father's finances or pressured him into decisions he didn't understand. My reputation was being systematically destroyed. Fourth, utility company records were mysteriously altered to remove my name from accounts I'd managed for years, erasing documentary proof that I'd lived in and maintained the house during Dad's illness. When I requested copies directly from the companies, the records showed Daniel's name going back 18 months, as if I'd never been involved. At a family gathering I attended hoping to find support, Daniel publicly called me uninvolved and absent during the final year of Dad's life, rewriting history in front of people who should have known better. Something shifted in me during those weeks of escalating betrayal. I stopped trying to argue with relatives or defend myself in family group chats where everyone seemed to believe Daniel's version of events. Instead, I began collecting certified records from independent sources they couldn't manipulate or alter. I gathered detailed caregiving logs I'd maintained for medical appointments, pharmacy receipts showing prescriptions I'd picked up and paid for, bank statements proving regular payments I'd made for utilities and household expenses. I pulled insurance claim forms where I was listed as primary contact and caregiver. My grief transformed during this process, hardening into something colder and more focused. Quiet resolve replaced shock and hurt. I wasn't going to beg or plead for fairness. I was going to let evidence speak in ways that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. What my family didn't know, what they'd failed to discover in their rush to exclude me, was that I had recorded several key conversations during Dad's final months of care. Not secretly or deceptively, but openly, using my phone to document his medical wishes and preferences, because his memory was failing and I needed clarity about what he wanted. In one of those recordings from 8 months before he died, Dad's voice was weak but absolutely clear, discussing how he wanted assets divided equally between his children, because I'd been the one actually present and caring for him. Olivia gets half of everything. She's earned it by being here when nobody else would. I'd saved a voicemail he left me 6 months before his death, a message where he thanked me for my sacrifice and explicitly stated his intentions about the house and savings. I'd also retained original signed documents that Dad and I had taken to Mr. Bennett's office for proper filing, paperwork that existed in secure legal storage, independent of anything Daniel could access or alter. I noticed something else during my evidence review. Multiple affidavits that relatives had submitted supporting Daniel's version of events used identical phrasing in key sections, word-for-word matches that suggested coordination and coaching rather than independent recollection. That kind of consistency indicated fabrication. I quietly requested verification of all submitted documents through proper legal channels, filing a formal inquiry with the probate court without informing my family I'd taken that step. I organized all my evidence into a detailed timeline I labeled simply care and intent, showing what I'd done, when I'd done it, and what Dad had said about his wishes during lucid moments. I wasn't preparing to make emotional arguments about fairness or family loyalty. I was preparing to present documented truth that existed in recordings, receipts, and official files that couldn't be disputed or dismissed as misunderstanding. I waited silently while my family celebrated their assumed victory. The person who changed everything was Mr. Bennett, the longtime family lawyer who'd handled Dad's legal affairs for over 20 years and had witnessed firsthand my role in his care during the final years. He contacted me privately 3 days after the funeral funeral reception, asking to meet at his office away from family interference. The office smelled like leather and old paper, quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He sat across from me at his desk and folded his hands carefully. "Olivia, I need you to know something about the document your brother presented at the funeral. There are significant inconsistencies with the signature and dating that concern me professionally." He explained that Daniel had submitted the alleged waiver through unofficial channels, avoiding the formal filing process that would have triggered verification. More importantly, Mr. Bennett revealed that a second will existed, one Dad had updated and properly filed just 6 months before his death. "Your father came to see me privately. He was very clear about his intentions and very concerned about what might happen after he passed. He advised me strongly to remain completely silent about what I knew and let the formal legal procedure expose the discrepancies naturally through official channels. Don't engage with Daniel or try to defend yourself. Let the system work the way it's designed to work." Meanwhile, my brother grew increasingly confident with each passing day. He made plans for extensive renovations to the house, hiring contractors to provide estimates and discussing which walls to remove. He talked about selling Dad's car and furniture, making decisions unilaterally about family heirlooms. Relatives publicly thanked him on social media for protecting the family's interests and handling complicated estate matters with such efficiency and clarity. I stayed completely silent through all of it, resisting every urge to argue or correct the false narrative being built. I continued documenting every public statement Daniel made, every claim about Dad's wishes, every assertion about what I supposedly agreed to or didn't do. Screenshots, saved posts, recorded conversations, all of it organized chronologically. Tension built steadily as the formal will reading was finally scheduled, a required legal procedure that Daniel assumed would be a mere formality, confirming what he'd already decided. He showed up to that appointment confident and relaxed, treating it like a bureaucratic box to check rather than a moment that could change everything. The formal will reading was held at Mr. Bennett's law office in a conference room with wood paneling and uncomfortable chairs that squeaked when anyone shifted weight. My brother arrived with our aunt and uncle, all three of them dressed casually and chatting about weekend plans like this was an inconvenience rather than a significant legal proceeding. I sat alone on the opposite side of the table, quiet and composed, waiting. Mr. Bennett entered carrying multiple folders and a small recording device. He took his seat and began speaking in his professional attorney voice, calm and measured. Daniel immediately tried to take control, presenting the alleged waiver document again and demanding that it be entered into the official record. "This shows clearly that Olivia waived her rights. We just need to formalize the distribution accordingly." Mr. Bennett accepted the document without comment, setting it aside deliberately. Then he opened the sealed folder he'd brought. "Before we proceed, I need to inform all parties present that a second will was filed with this office 6 months prior to the deceased's passing. This document supersedes all previous wills and explicitly updates the distribution of assets." The room went completely silent. Daniel's confident expression faltered. Mr. Bennett began reading from the updated will. "I leave my home and 50% of all financial assets to my daughter, Olivia Carter, in recognition of her dedicated caregiving and unwavering presence during my final years." He continued reading provisions that acknowledged specifically what I'd sacrificed and provided. Then, he did something I hadn't expected. He pressed play on the recording device. Dad's voice filled the conference room, that voicemail I'd saved where he clearly stated his intentions. "Olivia, I want you to know the house is yours. You've earned it by being here, by giving up opportunities to take care of me. Don't let anyone tell you different." The sound of his voice made tears well in my eyes, but I stayed composed. Mr. Bennett presented additional evidence next, highlighting clear inconsistencies in the waiver document Daniel had submitted. The signature didn't match exemplars on file. The date contradicted medical records showing Dad had been heavily sedated that day. The notary stamp was from someone who hadn't been licensed during the alleged signing period. Daniel stammered, his face flushing red. "There must be some confusion. Dad told me he wanted things divided based on financial need, not just caregiving." Mr. Bennett's expression didn't change. The later will is legally binding and properly executed. The waiver document contains irregularities that raise serious questions about authenticity. My uncle tried to interject, but Mr. Bennett raised his hand. The estate will be distributed according to the most recent, validly executed will. Any challenges must be filed through proper legal channels with substantial evidence. Relatives fell silent as the legal authority became undeniable. Power in that room shifted instantly. I spoke then, my voice quiet but firm. I stayed when it mattered, every day, every night. Dad knew that. He made sure the truth was protected even after he couldn't speak it himself. The estate distribution process was immediately halted pending a thorough review of Daniel's submitted documents and the circumstances around the alleged waiver. I was formally recognized as co-heir according to Dad's updated will and appointed as co-executor alongside a neutral third-party administrator. An investigation was initiated into possible document falsification, with Daniel receiving formal notice that his submissions were under scrutiny. My brother began distancing himself from the relatives who'd publicly supported him, each person suddenly claiming they'd been misled or hadn't fully understood the situation. Some family members sent quiet apologies through mutual friends, carefully worded messages that expressed regret without admitting they'd knowingly participated in anything wrong. Others simply disappeared from my life entirely, unfriending me on social media and avoiding any contact or acknowledgement. I inherited Dad's house as he'd intended and spent months carefully preserving it, keeping his study exactly as he'd left it, maintaining the garden he'd loved, honoring the life he'd built over decades. I reflected often during that time on how silence, combined with thorough documentation, protected the truth when loud voices and confident lies could have buried it. I learned that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't argument or confrontation, but patient collection of evidence that speaks undeniably when the moment arrives. The final thought I kept returning to was simple but profound. Truth does not need to shout or demand attention. It waits, recorded in documents and systems and voices that can't be erased, ready to speak when called upon. Undeniable, because it exists independent of anyone's version of events. If your family ever tried to push you aside during inheritance decisions or erase your contributions after someone died, you know exactly how devastating that feels. Being excluded despite your sacrifices, having your reality rewritten by people who weren't present, cuts deeper than most betrayals. Share your story in the comments about being dismissed or erased when you deserved recognition. Subscribe to join a community that values truth and accountability over convenience and false narratives. Your voice matters here more than you know. Click hype to help this story reach others who desperately need to hear it. Standing up for yourself is tough, especially when grief and family pressure collide at the worst possible moment. If you've faced something similar, subscribe and become part of this community of people who refuse to disappear quietly. Let me know this story mattered by clicking hype so it reaches more people. And tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel.